One of the websites that I've signed up to is a site called Quora. And Quora is an opportunity for people to ask questions and to answer those questions. And I have an email delivered to my email mailbox every day with a digest of some of the answers that have been given in the previous day. So one of the questions that I saw come up in my digest a few days ago was this one. As an enlisted service member, what did an officer do to earn your respect? And here is the way one man answers that question. As a young E3 in 1988, I was on guard duty at 0300 hours. Someone approached my post on foot. I approached and gave him the challenge word. He held his hands in plain sight and gave the proper password. As I approached him closer, I saw his rank and his name tape. It was Walter J. Malm. He was a full colonel at that time and had been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in Vietnam. Up until that point, I had heard of him and I knew who he was, but had never met him. Despite me being a PFC at the time and him being a colonel, he didn't talk down to me. He treated me as an equal. We talked about cars, motorcycles, hockey, girls, guns, and just stuff in general. He took great interest in how things were going with me and the army and told me if I needed any help with anything, I could always stop in and see him. He even asked if I had any ideas or suggestions on how to improve things. All in all, we talked for over an hour or so. One of the finest officers I've ever had the pleasure of serving with. So today, we're considering these words. The greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. I very much enjoyed researching this passage. One of the things that I find as I read it is that words like this occur in each of the four Gospels. Although you might remember when we talked about the Great Commission a few weeks ago that the character of each of these sayings is quite different in each Gospel, and it shows something of the character, the individual character of the Gospels. So when we look at Matthew's Gospel, we find these words, or words like them, occurring twice. They occur first in chapter 20 and then chapter 23. Now, in the first instance, it comes immediately after Jesus has predicted his death and his resurrection. And it is not the disciples who approach him. It is actually the disciples' mother, Salome, who is the mother of James and John, who make the request that her sons sit on the right and the left of the Lord in his kingdom. Then in chapter 23, when the Lord uses similar words, he's actually using it as a criticism of the Pharisees. It's that passage, very well known, you may remember, where he repeatedly says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." So those are Matthew's two versions of these words. In Mark's Gospel, again, they occur twice. On both of the occasions, Jesus predicts his death and his resurrection. Now, in the first occurrence, it is all 12 disciples who are disputing among themselves who will be the greatest. And what Jesus does is to bring a little child in their midst. And he says, "Whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me." And then a chapter later on, in chapter 10, again it's James and John. This time it's the disciples themselves who approach the Lord. And here Jesus refers to himself as a servant. In Luke's Gospel, again, something happens twice. The first one's chapter 14, and he doesn't quite use these words, but he's present at a banquet and he's noticing how people choose the best seating for themselves. And he refers to this as a parable and suggests you're far better actually to choose the lower seating and be promoted rather than choose the best seating and being asked to move. And then chapter 22, as we heard Alex read this morning, takes place after the institution of the Holy Supper. It seems to involve all the disciples, and Jesus again refers to himself as serving. And then in John's Gospel, it occurs once. And Jesus actually doesn't use these words at all. What he does is he washes the disciples' feet. He shows himself in service, and he suggests that the disciples ought to do the same. As a young teacher and a young minister, I quickly learnt quite a lot about myself. I learnt my tendency to escalate conflict far too quickly and easily. I tended to go into the classroom trying to stamp my authority upon my class and my students. And if you've ever had an opportunity to do that yourself, you can well imagine how that might have turned out. I learnt in my first year of teaching that as I raise my voice to shout, what happens? Well, what happened was my class would very quickly raise theirs as well. It became a kind of a competition who could speak the loudest or shout the loudest in class. You can well imagine that there was one of me against 30 of them, and I was bound to be the loser. But in that first year, one of the things that happened was, on one particular occasion I remember quite vividly, I got laryngitis. I spent a few days at home recovering, and I went back to work, still not 100%, but I taught. I felt well enough, it's just my voice would give out rather quickly. What I discovered having laryngitis as a teacher was, because I was unable to speak loudly, my class, consciously or unconsciously, I don't know, my class matched my volume. So whilst I could not shout, they would not shout either. And it was quite a lesson for me that I was very much in control of the class in that way, that if I chose to shout, they would shout back. If I kept my voice low and quiet and calm, they would do the same. It was a difficult lesson to practice, but it was one that I learnt nevertheless. And then I also learnt the power of praise. In my second year, I remember hearing someone say, they'd quoted some research, and they said that in order for your criticism to be heard, you needed to praise twice as often. Twice as often. So, 2 compliments to 1 criticism. I tried to practice that. What I did in my second year of teaching was I had 2 sheets in the front of my teacher's notebook. On one sheet, I recorded all the criticisms that I gave. On the second sheet, I recorded all the praise. What did I learn? I learnt that I was very good at offering criticism. I filled that sheet up many, many times during the course of that year, but I struggled to fill the second sheet with praise. I wanted to be heard by my class. I wanted to stamp my authority on the class. And how was I going to achieve that? Well, it was certainly not by means of force. As I said, my voice, if I raised it, was very, very quickly overwhelmed by 30 other voices shouting in return. So that was pointless. And what is more is that learning is a cooperative venture. It's not something I can impose on people, it's something that I must encourage in them. What we learn is that there's a big difference between demanding respect and commanding respect. Let's just return to that story I told at the beginning. What did that commanding officer do? He treated me as an equal. He took great interest in how things were going with me, and if I needed any help with anything, he showed his care. We talked for around an hour or so. He was generous with his time. He asked if I had any ideas or suggestions. He listened. And did you hear the description that the soldier gave at the end of the passage? One of the finest officers I have ever served with. We talk about demanding respect and commanding respect, and there is a significant difference between the two. And it's really revealed in the very beginning of the words. If we think about demand, mand, M-A-N-D, the middle part of that word comes from the word that we use to derive mandate. It's a rule of law or a command. It's someone being in authority. D, when we make it demand, D means down, to command down, to put oneself up above others and to issue orders. But if we look at the word command, that beginning, that prefix C-O-M, com, means with, to rule with. And that's a significant difference. It's the same beginning of the word companion, which means to eat bread with. So one of the things that I had to learn as a young teacher was to command respect, not demand it. There's an interesting study has been made, and I found this article quite easily yesterday. This is a 2006 survey by the Harvard Business Review revealed that being an introvert was viewed as a barrier to leadership by 65% of senior corporate executives polled. However, on the other hand, companies with introverted CEOs routinely outperformed those of extroverted leaders, according to a study conducted by Harvard, Stanford, and the University of Chicago and published by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Why is that? Well, I would suggest that it's those people in command who are able to encourage other people to express their opinions and thoughts. They encourage their inspiration, their creativity. And this pooling of resources is what leads to these companies' successes. And it's no wonder that these companies have much greater success than those who have a chief executive officer who merely imposes their own will and says, this is my idea, we are going to do it irrespective of what you have to say or what you think. You can see it's one person's thoughts and ideas against a pooling of everybody's thoughts and ideas. And it's that pooling which is so useful when it comes to the results and the bottom line of a company. The key, I think, is to recognise what matters. If we go and think about the military again, there are certainly times in the military where an officer says jump and the men say how high. That's clearly the way that the Army and the Navy work, that someone gives a command and another person follows. However, there are also those times when there's an opportunity for officers to show their care and concern, to give of their time, to ask of the opinions of their subordinates. And far from being counterproductive, that time is what leads those men to follow the orders when the going gets tough and they don't understand what's being told to them. They merely follow the command because they know that their commanding officer has their best interests at heart. It leads them to put their trust in that command. And what about my teaching situation? Well, teaching is not about imposing my will upon my class. Teaching is about engaging in learning. And when we can all focus on that as the important thing, as the aim of the group, the purpose of why we are there, then we can get about the business. So to lead effectively is to serve the purpose at hand and not to serve oneself and not to serve the rank that one enjoys above another person. I want to share with you a very useful idea, and it comes from the teachings of our church. Swedenborg writes this: natural thought is inseparably bound up with notions of space, time, personality, and material. And because of this, these thoughts are very limited and restricted. The thoughts of angels of the middle heaven, on the other hand, are all without notions of space, time, personality, and material, so that they are unlimited and unrestricted. When Swedenborg looks at the Bible, he suggests that in order to think spiritually, we must remove from our thinking ideas of space and time, personality, and materialism. Well, how do we do that? Now, here's my example. Early on in my ministry, I encountered this passage that I really struggled with. Swedenborg is talking here about the conflict that might occur within a church between the priest or minister and his congregation. And he writes, anyone whose belief is different from the priest's should be left in peace, provided he does not make trouble. If he does make trouble, he should be expelled. For this too is in accordance with order, for which purpose the priesthood exists. Now, as a young man coming into the ministry, I struggled with this idea. Is it right that I should just expel anybody who expresses a difference of opinion with me? I felt that was not right. Well, here's how I understood it. Rather than thinking about me as the priest or minister, I felt it useful to think about the role and purpose of the priesthood or the ministry. And so it's tied up with a passage like this. The good of the priesthood is to provide for the salvation of souls, to teach the way to heaven, and to lead those whom he teaches. It becomes not so much about your disagreement with me, it becomes about our looking towards this as the most important principle. To provide for the salvation of souls, to teach the way to heaven, and to lead those whom he teaches. Those are the things which we ought not to oppose. Do you see? It's removing the idea of person. It's removing the idea of me out of the equation and looking at what is most important, what is fundamental about what we do together. Take person out of it. So the priesthood is not about the person who does the job. It is about the principle that he serves. We've talked in the last few weeks about debate. Now, debate should never be about winning. But of course, that's often how it comes about. That's how we feel it sometimes. Debate is about discovering the truth together. And we do that actually better when there are more perspectives on the table. And a good leader recognises this. It's not about you kowtowing to my view. It's about us sharing our views together and then together looking at the pool of resources we have in front of us and picking out the best. But whose views and opinions are the most important? Well, it's the wrong question, isn't it? It's the overall purpose that defines, in any given situation, what is right. And we need to separate out the idea of personality or seniority or experience or commitment. It's not about me. We frequently confuse the value of our own opinions and thoughts with our self-identity. And we frequently believe that our position validates our opinions and ideas. We can all identify the value of pooling our resources in the way that I've described, and doing so at arm's length without reference to person. But of course, when we get involved in that, it becomes so much harder. So for the week ahead, I'm going to ask you to do this. I want you to reflect upon leadership that you have been in, and perhaps you might reflect upon the actions of leaders you have known. What are the qualities that make or break leadership? And then I want you to explore that idea of removing the idea of person from your interactions with others. When you have a discussion or a debate, just notice how much you invest your own identity in what you have to say. Is it possible for you to step back and to merely offer your idea, ask the other person or other people to offer theirs, and then together to consider the best option? And ask yourself also, do you demand respect or do you command it?